Number 10. Elizabeth Báthory. Some royal women became terrifying because they ruled kingdoms, but others became terrifying because history remembered them as if noble power itself had turned predatory. Elizabeth Báthory belongs to that darker category of aristocratic legend. A Hungarian countess rather than a reigning queen, she stands on this list because few women of rank were ever transformed so completely into a symbol of blood, cruelty, and aristocratic horror. Her name survived not merely through accusation, but through a reputation so extreme that it began to live somewhere between documented crime and Gothic nightmare. That is what gives her such enduring force. She is remembered not as a distant administrator or court manipulator, but as a woman whose power allegedly withdrew behind castle walls and became intimate, secretive, and monstrously personal. What makes Báthory so powerful in historical imagination is the atmosphere around the case. Castles, servants, isolation, noble immunity, and whispered violence all combine to create the kind of setting in which fear grows faster than proof. The accusations against her became infamous because they seemed to express one of history's oldest terrors about unchecked aristocratic privilege, that rank can create a private world in which cruelty is hidden, normalized, and protected until rumor becomes the only thing escaping the walls. Whether every legend attached to her is true is another matter entirely. That uncertainty is central to why she remains so haunting. Some accounts may reflect real brutality. Others may have been amplified by political motives, misogyny, sensational retelling, or the simple human hunger to turn a feared noblewoman into something almost superhumanly depraved. That tension between fact and legend is exactly what gives Elizabeth Báthory lasting power. The more exaggerated the stories became, the more they revealed the anxieties of the world that preserved them. A woman of rank accused of extraordinary sadism did not remain merely a criminal suspect in public memory. She became a warning about female power detached from maternal or dynastic roles and fused instead with secrecy, punishment, and blood. Men of rank committed horrors throughout history and were often remembered as tyrants or butchers, but Báthory was given something darker, the aura of a noblewoman whose very femininity had become part of the dread. That is why her image remained so durable. She was not remembered as merely cruel. She was remembered as unnatural. What keeps Elizabeth Báthory haunting is not simply the scale of the allegations, but the way her story reveals how quickly history transforms a powerful woman into an enduring nightmare once cruelty, class, and gender converge in the same figure. She remains terrifying because she stands at the threshold where court record becomes myth, where punishment becomes legend, and where a noble house seems to generate its own private darkness beyond the reach of ordinary justice. Whether one sees her primarily as a sadistic aristocrat, a politically useful monster, or some unstable mixture of both, her legacy still carries the same chill. She represents the fear that behind rank, beauty, and noble formality, power may become most frightening when it no longer needs to answer to anyone at all. Number 9. Boudica. Some royal women terrified history because they ruled from thrones, but others terrified it because they turned loss, humiliation, and occupation into open war. Boudica belongs to that second and more explosive category of power. Queen of the Iceni in Roman Britain, she has survived as one of the most unforgettable female figures in the ancient world, not because she governed through palace intrigue, but because she became the face of revolt itself. That is what gives her such force. Boudica is not remembered as a courtly queen wrapped in ceremony. She is remembered as a woman who answered imperial violence with a fury large enough to set Roman order trembling. In that transformation, she became more than a ruler. She became a historical nightmare for empire. What makes Boudica so powerful is the emotional clarity of her story. Her legend is built on injury, violation, vengeance, and uprising, on the moment when private suffering expands into collective destruction. Rome understood rebellion as a threat in military terms, but a rebellion led by a queen carried a different symbolic danger. It suggested that imperial dominance had not simply provoked resistance. It had awakened a force the empire could neither easily predict nor comfortably absorb into its usual categories of contempt. A male war leader could be dismissed as another barbarian enemy. A royal woman leading fire and slaughter through Roman settlements became something more destabilizing. She turned the conquered edge of empire into a place where Rome itself briefly appeared vulnerable. That is why Boudica's memory has remained so potent. She embodies one of the oldest and most frightening truths about power. Humiliation does not always produce submission. Sometimes it produces retaliation so intense that history remembers it not just as war, but as reckoning. The destruction associated with her revolt gave later chroniclers exactly the kind of material from which fearsome reputations are built. Cities burned, civilians died, and the Roman world was forced to confront the fact that a woman it might have expected to break had instead become the center of organized devastation. Whether later retellings heightened her image or not, the emotional structure remains intact. Boudica became terrifying because she proved that female sovereignty under pressure could harden into military wrath. What keeps Boudica haunting is that she reveals a form of royal female power unlike the others on this list. She was not feared because of whispered poisonings or palace schemes, but because she made rage political and made politics burn. Her legacy survives at the intersection of resistance and terror, where liberation for one people can look like apocalypse to another. That ambiguity is part of her strength. She can be remembered as heroine, avenger, rebel, or destroyer, and none of those names fully erase the others. History feared Boudica because she showed that a queen could become the visible shape of collective vengeance, and once that happened, the empire was forced to see something it always dreads most. Not just a rival ruler, but a symbol powerful enough to turn memory itself against conquest. Number 8. Empress Lu. Some royal women terrified history because they conquered from the front, but others did something more enduringly unsettling. They mastered the interior machinery of power so completely that the court itself became an instrument of fear. Empress Lu belongs to that darker category of dynastic authority. As one of the most formidable women of early imperial China, she did not simply survive the death of an emperor and fade into ceremonial irrelevance. She moved into the vacuum, shaped succession, controlled the state, and became the center of a political order that later historians often described with a mixture of awe, hostility, and horror. That is what gives her such enduring force. She is remembered not only as a consort who gained influence, but as a woman who refused to let influence end where male legitimacy expected it to end. What makes Empress Lu so powerful in historical memory is the intimacy of the fear attached to her. Her reputation was not built primarily through battlefield spectacle or distant war, but through palace violence, elimination of rivals, and ruthless dynastic control. Courts are often most frightening when they appear civilized on the surface and lethal underneath. And Lu's legacy survives precisely because it seems to reveal that contradiction in its most concentrated form. The throne remained, the rituals remained, the language of order remained, yet beneath them moved calculations, punishments, and consolidations so severe that later generations preserved her name as a warning about what happens when royal power enters the hands of someone unwilling to play the role history wanted assigned to her. That reputation, however, must be read carefully. Empress Lu's memory passed through chroniclers and political traditions deeply invested in defining female power as dangerous when it escaped prescribed boundaries. That does not mean her brutality was invented, but it does mean the emotional temperature of the record matters. Women who controlled succession, removed enemies, and placed family interests above abstract morality were often remembered with a special intensity of condemnation, especially when they succeeded too visibly. The result is that Lu survives in two forms at once, as a genuinely ruthless political actor and as a historical symbol sharpened by later discomfort with female dominance. That fusion is what makes her so compelling. She is both person and warning, What keeps Empress Lu haunting is that she represents a form of power history repeatedly claims to fear, while also repeatedly producing. The capacity of a court widow or consort to become sovereign in all but name and to reshape the state from behind the veil of legitimacy. She remains terrifying because her story exposes how thin the line can be between guardian of dynasty and devourer of rivals. In her legacy, the palace becomes a sealed ecosystem of memory, vengeance, and strategic violence, and the woman at its center becomes unforgettable, not because she was merely ambitious, but because she proved that ambition in a royal woman could become structurally absolute. History feared her because she showed that a throne need not be occupied directly in order to be controlled completely. Number 7. Queen Tamar. Some royal women terrified history because they were remembered as cruel, but others did something more complicated and, in a different way, just as unsettling. They ruled so successfully, so forcefully, and so completely that they broke the expected grammar of power itself. Queen Tamar of Georgia belongs to that rarer category. She is often remembered as one of the greatest rulers of medieval Georgia, a monarch associated with expansion, prestige, and cultural flourishing. Yet what made her formidable was not merely prosperity. It was authority. Tamar did not survive as a timid exception inside a male world. She ruled in a way that made later memory struggle to decide whether to describe her as queen, king, or something beyond those categories. That is what gives her such force. She did not simply occupy power, she normalized it around herself. What made Tamar so powerful in historical imagination was the combination of legitimacy and command. Many royal women gained influence through marriage, regency, or crisis, but Tamar's position became more formidable because she exercised sovereignty with a directness that challenged the reflexive assumptions of her age. She ruled over nobles, military action, religious politics, and dynastic concerns in a way that made female authority impossible to reduce to symbolism alone. That kind of power can be as frightening to historical structures as overt brutality. A violent woman may be condemned as an aberration, but a highly effective ruling woman threatens something deeper. She suggests that exclusion was never necessity, only design. That is one of the reasons Tamar remained such a potent figure. Her strength was not theatrical, it was functional. At the same time, the fear attached to Tamar is subtler than in cases built around murder or court bloodshed. She terrified history less through grotesque legend and more through what her success implied. In male-dominated chronicles and political traditions, a woman who governed well did not automatically become safe in memory. Sometimes she became more unsettling because she deprived her critics of easy arguments. If she failed, she could be dismissed. If she triumphed, she had to be translated into something exceptional enough not to become a precedent. That dynamic helps explain why Tamar's image has always carried more than admiration. It also carries the shadow of a question history rarely likes to answer honestly. What happens when a woman rules so well that the old excuses against her rule collapse? What keeps Queen Tamar haunting in the broader history of royal women is that she represents the fear of female sovereignty at its most intellectually dangerous. She was not remembered primarily as a poisoner, seductress, or blood-drunk tyrant. She was remembered as proof that a crown worn by a woman could command armies, shape a realm, and build a legacy strong enough to rival or surpass male predecessors. That kind of example can terrify a tradition more lastingly than scandal ever could. Tamar endures because she shows that history does not fear women only when they are monstrous. Sometimes it fears them because they are too effective, too legitimate, and too difficult to diminish without revealing the weakness of the order that tried to contain them. Number 6. Agrippina the Younger. Some royal women terrified history because they ruled openly, but others did something more corrosive and, in Roman memory, even more unforgivable. They mastered influence so completely that the empire seemed to bend around them without ever fully admitting it. Agrippina the Younger belongs to that darker category of dynastic power. Daughter of Germanicus, sister of Caligula, wife of Claudius and mother of Nero, she stands at the center of one of the most unsettling bloodlines in imperial history. That alone would have been enough to make her memorable. But what gave her lasting force was the sense that she did not merely survive proximity to Roman power. She manipulated it, redirected it, and treated the imperial household as something to be arranged according to her will. In a political culture already soaked in suspicion, that made her not just formidable but dangerous in the most intimate possible way. What makes Agrippina so powerful in historical memory is that her story seems to gather every Roman anxiety about female influence into one figure. Dynasty, succession, poison, sexual scandal, political calculation, and the corruption of paternal order all converge around her. Whether every accusation preserved by ancient sources deserves belief is another matter, and with Roman history that question always matters, because hostile male chroniclers often transformed powerful women into moral warnings. But even if the record is sharpened by misogyny and theatrical hostility, the structure of Agrippina's reputation remains revealing. She was remembered as a woman who understood that in an imperial court, motherhood could become a weapon, marriage could become a strategy, and legitimacy itself could be guided toward the future she wanted. That is what made her terrifying. Agrippina was not feared simply as an ambitious woman. She was feared as a woman who seemed to understand the machinery of empire too well. She operated inside the family, which in Rome was never merely private. It was the breeding ground of succession, loyalty, and state continuity. To seize influence, there was to place one's hands very near the throat of the empire itself. That is why stories of her survived with such heat. A queen on a distant throne can be cast as foreign, but a Roman imperial woman who bends the center of power from within becomes something more disturbing. She transforms the household into a battlefield and maternity into political design. What keeps Agrippina haunting is that her fate ultimately reveals the cost of that power. In Roman memory, she becomes one of the clearest examples of female ambition rising inside a dynastic world too paranoid to tolerate it forever. She is feared first as the architect of ascent, then destroyed as though the empire needed to erase the very force it had allowed to flourish. That arc is part of why she remains unforgettable. Agrippina terrifies history because she stands at the threshold where family becomes regime, where maternal closeness becomes political control, and where a woman's intelligence is preserved not as virtue but as menace. Whether the ancient sources judged her fairly or not, they could not forget her, and that alone says how fully she forced history to look at a woman who knew exactly how power worked. Number 5. Catherine the Great. Some royal women terrified history through blood and scandal, but others did so through scale. Catherine the Great belongs to that second category of fear, the fear inspired by a ruler whose authority becomes too large, too durable, and too successful to fit comfortably inside the expectations attached to her gender. Empress of Russia, Catherine is often remembered through contradiction. Enlightened and autocratic, intellectually brilliant and politically ruthless, culturally sophisticated and relentlessly imperial. That tension is what gives her enduring force. She was not frightening because she failed and descended into infamy. She was frightening because she succeeded so completely that history had to surround her with rumor, sexual myth and moral unease in order to make her feel containable again. What makes Catherine so powerful in historical imagination is the way she combined court intelligence with state expansion. She did not merely occupy a throne, she enlarged the world attached to it. Territory, administration, diplomacy, patronage, and imperial ambition all intensified under her, and that kind of magnitude creates a special kind of fear in the record. A woman who survives in power can be treated as exceptional. A woman who flourishes in power and leaves the state larger, more centralized and more feared than before becomes harder to explain away. That is often when history reaches for scandal. The more politically successful the woman, the more eagerly later memory tries to reframe her as excessive in body, appetite, vanity, or private corruption. Catherine suffered exactly that fate. The sexual legends attached to her are among the clearest examples of how history punishes female sovereignty by attempting to degrade it into grotesque anecdote. These stories say less about Catherine herself than about the discomfort she generated. Men who expanded empires were often celebrated as virile, commanding, and world historical. Catherine's expansion had to be balanced in the hostile imagination by narratives that made her ridiculous, obscene, or morally uncontrolled. That does not erase the fact that her rule could be harsh, imperial, and strategically ruthless. But it does reveal that fear of her power did not stop at politics. It invaded memory itself. Her enemies and later gossips seemed determined to ensure that no woman who ruled so greatly could be remembered without contamination. What keeps Catherine the Great haunting is that she represents one of the clearest cases in which female political greatness itself became a source of terror. She was not merely a powerful woman at court. She was a sovereign mind operating at imperial scale, and that scale made her impossible to domesticate in historical memory. She remains unsettling because she reveals a truth history rarely confesses. The world is often less frightened by a cruel woman than by a capable one whose success proves she cannot be dismissed. Catherine terrified history because she made power look natural in female hands, while also making it expansive, strategic, and irreversible. That is why the crown around her never feels decorative. It feels heavy enough to alter continents. Number 4. Ranavalona I. Some royal women terrified history because they ruled through intrigue, but others did so because their rule seemed to fuse sovereignty itself with punishment, isolation, and fear on a national scale. Ranavalona I belongs to that darker category of power. Queen of Madagascar in the 19th century, she has survived in historical memory as one of the most feared female rulers of her age, a monarch associated with repression, suspicion, harsh justice, and a determination to defend her kingdom from foreign influence at an immense human cost. That is what gives her such enduring force. She was not remembered simply as a queen who resisted outsiders. She was remembered as a ruler whose resistance hardened into a system of rule so severe that later observers treated her name almost as a synonym for royal terror. What makes Ranavalona so powerful in the historical record is the scale of suffering attached to her reign. Courts often produce bloodshed behind walls, but in her case, the fear extended outward into the social body itself. Punishments, forced labor, political purges, ordeals, and a climate of suspicion contributed to an image of monarchy in which obedience was not merely expected, but extracted through fear. Whether every later description reflects the full truth or was shaped by hostile European voices angered by her rejection of foreign encroachment is a question that matters. But even when one reads the sources critically, the severity of her rule remains difficult to dismiss. That is part of why she survives so powerfully. She occupies a space where anti-colonial resistance and internal brutality coexist in ways that refuse simple moral comfort. That complexity is exactly what keeps Ranavalona haunting. She cannot be reduced to a caricature without losing something essential, but she also cannot be softened into a misunderstood nationalist sovereign without ignoring the weight of coercion associated with her government. History fears figures like this because they resist clean alignment with virtue or villainy. Ranavalona defended independence, but she did so in a manner that made the state feel less like protection than ordeal for many who lived beneath it. In her legacy, the throne becomes a fortress surrounded by enemies and sustained by fear, and the queen at its center becomes terrifying, not because she lacked purpose, but because her purpose could justify almost any severity. What keeps Ranavalona the first unforgettable is that she reveals one of the darkest forms of royal female power, the power to make survival of the realm and suffering of the people appear part of the same policy. She remains disturbing because her reign forces history to confront the possibility that fear can become a governing principle, not an accident, and that a woman on a throne could wield it with the same relentless force as any emperor or king. Ranavalona terrified history because she made sovereignty feel punitive, defensive, and absolute all at once. In her memory, the crown no longer symbolizes elegance or divine order. It becomes an iron instrument of endurance sharpened against both enemies and subjects alike. Number 3. Empress Theodora. Some royal women terrified history because they shed blood directly, but others did something more subtle and perhaps more destabilizing. They entered the highest level of empire, carrying origins, intelligence, and willpower that the elite around them could neither comfortably absorb nor easily control. Empress Theodora belongs to that rarer category of power, rising from a background that later chroniclers never allowed the world to forget. She became one of the most formidable women in Byzantine history, not as a shadow behind the throne, but as a political presence unmistakably felt within it. That is what gives her such enduring force. She did not merely marry power, she helped shape it, defend it, and harden it at moments when the empire itself seemed on the verge of collapse. What makes Theodora so powerful in historical memory is the intensity of the reaction she provoked. Byzantine politics was already a world of ceremony, theology, surveillance, and imperial distance, but Theodora introduced into that world something even more threatening than scandal: competence joined to audacity. She is remembered above all for her role during crisis, especially in the Nika revolt, when imperial hesitation met her refusal to yield. Whether every word later attributed to her is exact or stylized, the image that survived is unmistakable. At a moment when the empire could have broken, she became the voice of unflinching authority. That alone was enough to make her unforgettable. A woman who does not simply counsel courage but embodies it at the center of empire becomes difficult for history to treat as ordinary. At the same time, Theodora's reputation was shaped by a world deeply uncomfortable with women who could not be dismissed as ornamental. Her origins were used against her, her influence was moralized, and her presence at the side of Justinian was often described in ways that reveal as much about elite anxiety as about her actual conduct. But that discomfort is part of what makes her terrifying in the record. She represented the collapse of expected boundaries. She was not born into the role the empire later had to grant her, and yet once she occupied it, she proved impossible to ignore. For traditions built on hierarchy, that kind of ascent can be as frightening as cruelty. It suggests that power is not always where it is supposed to be, and that intelligence can arrive from below the social order and begin directing its summit. What keeps Empress Theodora haunting is that she reveals a form of royal female power history often fears most, not merely the power to intrigue, but the power to decide. She remains compelling because she stands at the threshold where charisma becomes statecraft, and where a woman once judged by status and reputation becomes indispensable to imperial survival. Theodora terrified history because she made strength look inseparable from her, and once that happened, even hostile memory could not reduce her to scandal alone. She survives as proof that a woman within the palace could become more than consort, more than ornament, more than warning. She could become one of the hard centers around which empire itself continued to turn. Number 2. Zetian. Some royal women terrified history because they ruled beside power, but others did something far more threatening. They stepped past every accepted limit and made the throne answer to them alone. Zetian belongs to that highest and darkest category of imperial authority. Rising from the Tang court to become the only woman in Chinese history to rule as emperor in her own name, she did not merely influence succession or guide policy from behind a screen. She crossed the final boundary. That is what gives her such enduring force. Zetian was not feared simply because she was powerful. She was feared because she transformed power itself, proving that the imperial center could be seized, occupied, and legitimized by a woman in a world built to declare that impossible. What makes Zetian so haunting in historical memory is the scale of her success, combined with the scale of hostility it generated. Courts often tolerate female influence so long as it remains indirect, personal, or temporary. Wu made it structural. She maneuvered through palace politics, eliminated rivals, reshaped the state, and established a reign so formidable that later historians could never decide whether to remember her primarily as a monster, a genius, or the most dangerous combination of both. That instability is exactly why she remains so powerful. A woman who merely failed could be dismissed. A woman who succeeded at imperial scale had to be explained away through fear. The record around her became saturated with accusations of ruthlessness, manipulation, bloodshed, and illegitimacy, not only because she may indeed have been ruthless, but because the system she overcame needed her to remain morally alarming. That is the deeper reason Wu Zetian terrified history. She did not simply inherit power under unusual circumstances. She mastered the machinery of empire well enough to force the empire to speak through her. Intelligence, statecraft, surveillance, patronage, calculated severity, and ideological reinvention all became part of her rule. Men had long used these instruments without becoming metaphysical threats to the social order. Wu did because her reign implied that the old exclusions were vulnerable. Once a woman could occupy the supreme title itself, the difference between natural hierarchy and constructed hierarchy became much harder to defend. That is often what history fears most. Not cruelty alone, but precedent. What keeps Wu Zetian haunting is that she remains one of the clearest examples of female sovereignty becoming indistinguishable from empire. She was not simply a scandalous consort, a dangerous mother, or a temporary regent. She became the state's central will. That is why later memory could never leave her alone. She had to be condemned, admired, feared, and mythologized all at once because no single category was large enough to contain what she represented. Wu Zetian terrified history because she showed that a woman could take the most exalted political form available, hold it, and force generations afterward to explain why that should never have been possible when it had already happened. Number 1. Catherine de' Medici. Some royal women terrified history because they ruled openly, some because they conquered empires, and some because they were remembered as symbols of blood. Catherine de' Medici stands at number 1 because no other woman on this list so completely fuses court intrigue, dynastic fear, religious violence, political survival, and the long shadow of historical demonization into one enduring legend of female power. Queen of France and later the dominant maternal force behind a fractured monarchy, Catherine survived in memory not merely as a ruler, but as an atmosphere. Poison, plots, massacre, black garments, court manipulation, and the sense of a monarchy rotting from within all gathered around her name until she became one of history's most enduring images of terrifying female authority. That is what gives her unmatched force. She was not remembered as a single act. She was remembered as a system of dread. What makes Catherine so powerful in the historical imagination is that she ruled through a world already near collapse. France in her lifetime was not stable ground. It was a kingdom torn by faction, confession, ambition, and the constant risk that dynastic weakness would become national ruin. Catherine moved through that environment not as an ornamental queen, but as a strategist of survival. And that is precisely what made her frightening. She became associated with influence exercised through sons, marriages, counsel, delay, pressure, and the delicate but often deadly management of impossible choices. In such a world, power easily takes on a sinister shape, especially when it is concentrated in a woman who enemies can portray as foreign, calculating, and unnatural. Catherine's reputation grew in that fertile ground, where policy, fear, and misogyny reinforced one another until the woman and the legend became nearly impossible to separate. The St. Bartholomew's Day massacre hangs especially heavily over her memory, and it is one of the chief reasons she remains so terrifying in the record. Whether one reads her exact responsibility narrowly or broadly, her name became fused with the idea of royal calculation turning into bloodshed, on a scale history could never forgive. That fusion matters because it transformed Catherine from a political actor into a symbol of state darkness itself. Many rulers presided over slaughter, but Catherine was remembered as though slaughter had become part of her style of power, intimate, cold, and cerebral. Once that image hardened, everything around her fed it. The Florentine aura, the court festivals masking tension, the maternal control, the whispered poison legends, the Black Widow aesthetic imposed by later imagination. She ceased to be merely historical. She became almost theatrical in her menace. What makes Catherine de' Medici worthy of the #1 place is that she represents the deepest fear history often attaches to powerful royal women. Not just that they can wield force, but that they can do so invisibly, continuously, and with a patience more frightening than open rage. She remains haunting because her legacy sits at the intersection of real political ruthlessness and centuries of hostile myth-making, and the two are now inseparable enough to make her unforgettable. Catherine terrified history because she appeared to embody the dark intelligence of monarchy itself. The crown thinking, waiting, calculating, and sacrificing what it must to endure. Whether that memory is fully just or not, it has survived for a reason. In Catherine, the court no longer feels like a place of etiquette and silk. It feels like a chamber where religion, bloodline, and power are being slowly arranged into catastrophe by hands elegant enough never to appear stained.